In December of 1941, Adolf Hitler made a fateful decision that would seal the fate of Nazi Germany. 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the German dictator stood before the Reichstag at the Kroll Opera House in Berlin and declared war on the United States of America. His speech lasted 88 minutes. In it, he dismissed America as a decaying society weakened by immigration and democracy, incapable of building the machines of modern warfare. He believed American capitalism was corrupt, its people soft, its factories primitive compared to German industrial might. Within 4 years, that supposed weakness would bury his U-boat fleet beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. American shipyards would flood Europe with more vessels than Germany could have imagined in its darkest nightmares. The nation Hitler dismissed as decayed would produce ships faster than his submarines could sink them, turning the tide of the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war. This is the story of the greatest industrial miscalculation in all of recorded military history. It is the story of how American shipyards, many of them run by determined men who had never built a boat in their lives, outproduced the entire German war machine. And it is the remarkable story of how that extraordinary production turned the tide of a battle that came closer to strangling Britain than most people today realize. The stakes in the Atlantic could not possibly have been higher. Britain, the very last major power standing against Hitler in Western Europe, depended entirely on supplies crossing 3,000 miles of dangerous ocean. Every bullet fired by a British soldier had to survive that crossing. Every drop of fuel that powered a British tank had to make it through. Every can of food that fed a British family had to run a gauntlet of German submarines lurking beneath the gray waters. Winston Churchill, a man not easily frightened, later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly terrified him during the entire war. If Germany could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would starve. The war would be lost before American soldiers ever set foot on European soil. Admiral Karl Dönitz understood this arithmetic with perfect clarity. Born in 1911, Dönitz had served in the U-boat arm during the First World War and had been captured after his submarine was sunk in the Mediterranean in 1918. He spent the rest of that war in a British prisoner of war camp, where he had plenty of time to think about submarine warfare and how it might be conducted more effectively. When Germany began secretly rebuilding its submarine force in violation of the Versailles Treaty, Dönitz was there from the beginning. By the time the Second World War began, he had become the foremost expert on submarine tactics in the German Navy. The commander of Germany's submarine fleet had spent years calculating exactly what it would take to win the tonnage war. Before America entered the conflict, he estimated that sinking 300,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would be enough to overwhelm British shipbuilding capacity and slowly strangle the island nation. His U-boats achieved that target in only 4 of the first 27 months of war, but Dönitz remained patient. He knew that if he could build enough submarines, the numbers would eventually work in his favor. After Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the conflict, Dönitz revised his calculations upward. With American shipyards now joining the effort, he would need to sink approximately 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month to win. His submarines achieved that figure in only 1 month during the entire war, November of 1942. It would prove to be the high watermark of German success. Dönitz was confident his growing U-boat fleet could eventually hit these numbers consistently. What he could not fathom was how catastrophically wrong German intelligence had been about American industrial capacity. Before the war, Dönitz had begged Hitler for 300 operational U-boat. He made this request directly to the Führer on September 28, 1939, at U-boat headquarters in Wilhelmshaven.
He argued this was the minimum force needed to defeat Britain through economic warfare. Hitler gave him 57. Even as the U-boat campaign reached its peak years later, German shipyards struggled to produce 20 new submarines per month. The production ramp-up was painfully slow. The total German submarine fleet did not exceed 400 commissioned boats until the spring of 1943, by which point the war in the Atlantic had already begun to turn. The number of boats actually operational and ready for combat at any given time was far lower, peaking at roughly 240. German analysts had studied American shipyards and concluded the United States could produce perhaps 8 million deadweight tons of new shipping per year at maximum effort. This estimate was not based on ignorance. German agents had visited American ports. They had counted the shipways and calculated the construction times. Their mathematics was sound by any conventional measure. What they failed to account for was something that existed nowhere else on Earth, something that would shatter every assumption about what was possible in warship construction. The reality proved catastrophic for German planning. American shipyards produced roughly 8 million deadweight tons in 1942 alone, matching the upper limit of what German intelligence had predicted as the absolute maximum. But then, production exploded beyond anything the Germans had imagined possible. In 1943, American yards delivered over 19 million deadweight tons, more than double their previous year's output, and far beyond what any analyst had predicted as the absolute maximum. At peak production, American shipyards were building at an annualized rate of over 20 million tons. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced targets of 185,000 aircraft for the American war effort, Hitler's advisors dismissed these numbers as propaganda. The United States actually produced over 300,000 aircraft. Hitler himself embodied this blindness most completely. His racial ideology convinced him that the United States was weakened by what he saw as the corruption of its bloodlines through immigration. He told his generals that the United States was a paper tiger, incapable of mobilizing for total war. In his private conversations recorded in what historians call Hitler's table talk, he expressed deep contempt for American society, pointing to racial diversity and social inequalities as fundamental weakness. The German leader pointed to the chaos of the Depression years as evidence of American decline. He dismissed reports of American industrial potential as propaganda designed to frighten Germany. This contempt ran so deep that when military advisors warned him about the sleeping giant across the Atlantic, he simply refused to listen. Germany would learn the cost of this arrogance in blood and iron beneath the waves of the Atlantic. The man who would prove Hitler wrong had never built a ship in his life. Henry Kaiser was a construction magnate from California who had made his fortune building roads, dams, and pipelines across the American West. He had paved 200 miles of road and built 500 bridges in Puma before returning to California to take on even larger projects. As chairman of a consortium called 6 Companies, he had overseen construction of the Hoover Dam, completing it 2 years ahead of schedule. He went on to build Bonneville Dam and Grand Coulee Dam and supplied the cement for Shasta Dam. But ships were something entirely new. When the Navy began looking for additional shipbuilders in 1940, Kaiser showed up with a simple pitch.
He told the admirals he could build cargo ships faster and cheaper than anyone else using the same techniques he had used to build dams. The Navy men were skeptical. Kaiser had no shipyards, no trained workers, no experience whatsoever with maritime construction. It was not even clear if he had ever been to sea. But he had something more valuable than any of those things. He had a vision for how to build ships like automobiles on an assembly line, and he had the track record of completing massive projects ahead of schedule and under budget. Kaiser partnered with Todd Shipyards in 1939 to form Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation, winning contracts for cargo vessels even before the war began.
In December of 1940, he received additional contracts from the Maritime Commission for 60 British Ocean-class cargo ships. He bought land along the California coast and started construction on new shipyards at Richmond in the San Francisco Bay Area. The first keel was laid on April 14, 1941. Within months, Kaiser had recruited workers from across the country, many of them farmers and shopkeepers who had never seen the ocean. He hired women in unprecedented numbers, eventually employing tens of thousands of female workers across his 7 shipyards. Women came to constitute over 27% of the workforce at Richmond alone, making up approximately 40% of welders. Kaiser also brought in African American workers at a time when most shipyards refused to hire them or relegated them to the most menial positions. He integrated his shipyards when union rules would have excluded black workers entirely. About 10% of Richmond workers were African American, roughly 10,000 people. The discrimination of the era did not disappear entirely. The Boilermakers Union created a segregated auxiliary with no voting rights, but Kaiser's willingness to hire based on ability rather than race helped transform American industry. And then Kaiser began revolutionizing the entire concept of how ships were built. Traditional shipbuilding was a craft passed down through generations of skilled workers. Experienced men laid, bent steel plates by hand, and riveted hulls together piece by piece in the shipyard. A typical cargo ship took a year or more to complete. Kaiser threw out the entire process. He standardized every component so that sections of ships could be prefabricated miles from the water and trucked to the yard for assembly. He replaced riveting with welding, a faster technique that also produced stronger joints. He broke down every job into simple tasks that workers could learn in weeks rather than the years required for traditional shipyard trades. The results astonished everyone, including the Navy. Kaiser's first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, was launched on September 27, 1941, in a ceremony attended by President Roosevelt. That ship took 244 days to build from keel laying to launch. Within months, Kaiser's yards had cut that time to under 45 days. The average construction time for Liberty ships across all yards eventually dropped to 42 days. And then, in November of 1942, Kaiser's Richmond Yard No. 2 achieved something that seemed impossible. The SS Robert E. Peary was built from keel laying to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. The keel was laid at 1 minute past midnight on November 8th. The completed ship slid down the ways on November 12th. This was not a publicity stunt or a hollow shell of a vessel. The Robert E. Peary was a fully functional cargo ship that served throughout the war, carrying supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific. It was proof that everything the Germans believed about American industry was wrong. Meanwhile, Admiral Dönitz was enjoying what his submarine commanders called the second happy time. When America entered the war in December 1941, the United States Navy was completely unprepared to defend its own coastline. There were not enough escort vessels, not enough aircraft, not enough coordination between military and civilian authorities. Cities along the eastern seaboard refused to implement blackouts, fearing the economic impact on tourism and entertainment. Ships silhouetted against the glow of Miami and Atlantic City and New York became easy targets for German submarines hunting just offshore. Commander Reinhard Hartigan of U-123 used tourist guides to New York to navigate the waters around New York Harbor, torpedoing ships within sight of the city lights. He could see the Ferris wheels and amusement park rides along the shore as he lined up his attacks. Hartigan would survive the war and live until 2018, reaching the age of 105. During his 2 drumbeat patrols, he sank 25 ships totaling over 136,000 tons. The carnage along the American coast was staggering. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank nearly 400 Allied ships in American and Caribbean waters, sending more than 2.25 million tons of cargo to the bottom. Off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, the destruction was so concentrated that merchant sailors and naval officers began calling the area Torpedo Junction. Over 80 ships went down in those waters alone. Bodies and wreckage washed up on beaches from Maine to Florida. Civilians found life jackets, oil-soaked debris, and sometimes the remains of merchant seamen on their morning walks along the shore. The American merchant marines suffered terribly during these months. Over 9,000 American merchant mariners died during the war.
A casualty rate higher than any branch of the armed services except the Marine Corps. These were civilian sailors, many of them Union men who had signed on for peacetime wages and found themselves in the middle of a shooting war with no combat training and minimal armament. On April 10, 1942, the tanker SS Gulf America was torpedoed approximately 5 miles off Jacksonville Beach, Florida. The attack happened at 10:20 in the evening. The ship was so close to shore that tourists on a boardwalk Ferris wheel watched the vessel burn and explode. Hardigan, the submarine commander, recorded in his log that he could see the beachgoers' faces illuminated red by the light of the burning ship. The Gulf America did not fully sink until April 16th. The Germans were winning, and they knew it. The second happy time would last until August of 1942, when improved American defenses finally made coastal operations too dangerous. But Dönitz faced a problem his superiors in Berlin refused to acknowledge. He needed more submarines, and he needed them quickly. Every boat lost in combat took months to replace. The German shipbuilding industry, already strained by the demands of tank production and aircraft manufacturing, could not keep pace with losses. Steel that might have built submarines went instead to tanks for the Eastern Front. Skilled workers who might have assembled U-boats were drafted into the Wehrmacht, and those losses were mounting as the Americans slowly organized their defenses and the British shared their hard-won expertise in anti-submarine warfare. Across the Atlantic, American shipyards were performing miracles that made German production look pathetic by comparison. The Maritime Commission had authorized the construction of 2,710 Liberty ships. Kaiser's yards were building them at the rate of 1 ship every single day at peak production. 18 American shipyards participated in the Liberty ship program, employing hundreds of thousands of workers around the clock. But Liberty ships were only part of the story. American yards were also producing warships at a pace that defied comprehension. The Two-Ocean Navy Act, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt on July 19, 1940, had authorized the largest naval expansion in history. The bill was a direct response to the fall of France just weeks earlier, which had shown that Britain might fall next, and America could face hostile powers controlling both the Atlantic and Pacific. The bill committed $4 billion to building 7 battleships, 18 aircraft carriers, 27 cruisers, 115 destroyers, and 43 submarines. It also authorized 6 Alaska-class large cruisers and 15,000 naval aircraft. But this was just the beginning. As the war progressed, American production far exceeded even these ambitious targets. Consider the destroyer Escort, a small warship designed specifically to hunt submarines and protect convoys. The concept did not even exist in the United States Navy before 1941. The designs originated from a British Lend-Lease request in June of that year. The first destroyer escort for the Royal Navy was commissioned on January 20, 1943. The first for the United States Navy, the USS Evarts, entered service on April 15th of the same year. By the war's end, American shipyards had produced 563 destroyer escorts across 6 different classes. The Evarts class numbered 97 ships. The Buckley class contributed 154. The Cannon class added 72.
the Edsall class 85, the Ruddow class 72, and the John C. Butler class 83. By late 1943, 16 shipyards were launching approximately 17 destroyer escorts every single month. These ships were not as fast or as heavily armed as fleet destroyers, but they were perfect for convoy escort duty, and America could build them faster than Germany could build the submarines meant to sink the ships they protected. The escort carrier program was even more remarkable. These small aircraft carriers, converted from merchant ship hulls, gave convoys their own air cover for the first time. Previously, convoys had to rely on land-based aircraft that could only reach part way across the Atlantic, leaving a deadly gap in the middle of the ocean where U-boat could hunt without fear of air attack. Escort carriers closed that gap permanently. The Kaiser Shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, launched 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers between November 1942 and July 1944. That works out to one carrier approximately every 8 days. The total American production of escort carriers reached 122 ships. Germany, by contrast, launched but never completed a single aircraft carrier during the entire war. The Graf Zeppelin was laid down in 1936 and reached 85% completion, but Admiral Donitz himself ordered work permanently halted in February 1943. The Hulk was scuttled in April 1945. Germany never operated a carrier of any type. By the spring of 1943, the flood of new American ships began changing the mathematics of the Atlantic War. The convoy system, which the United States Navy had initially resisted despite British urging, went into full effect. The British had learned the hard way during the First World War that ships traveling alone were easy prey for submarines, while ships traveling in groups could be protected by escorts. American naval officers had to relearn this lesson at the cost of hundreds of ships and thousands of lives during the Second Happy Time. Once the convoy system was fully implemented, groups of merchant ships traveled together under the protection of destroyer escorts equipped with radar, sonar, and new weapons specifically designed to kill submarines. The most important of these new weapons was the Hedgehog. Unlike traditional depth charges that exploded at preset depths regardless of whether they hit anything, the Hedgehog threw a pattern of 24 contact-fused bombs ahead of the attacking ship. The projectiles landed in an elliptical pattern, roughly 140 by 120 feet, at about 200 yards range. They only detonated when they actually struck a submarine, which meant they did not disturb the water and blind the escort's sonar the way depth charge explosions did. The improvement in effectiveness was dramatic.
Hedgehog achieved 1 kill for every 5.7 attacks, compared to 1 kill per 60 attacks for depth charges. It was more than 10 times as effective. High-frequency direction-finding equipment, which Allied sailors called Huffduff, could pinpoint a U-boat the moment it transmitted a radio message. The Germans did not realize that every time they reported their position or received orders from headquarters, they were revealing their location to the enemy. 2 or more ships equipped with Huffduff could triangulate a submarine's position and vector in attacks. This technology contributed to nearly 1/4 of all U-boat losses during the war. The breaking point came in May of 1943, a month the Germans would later call Black May. It would prove to be the decisive turning point of the entire Atlantic campaign. Donitz had assembled his largest wolf pack ever, over 50 submarines, to attack convoy ONS-5, crossing from Britain to North America. The Germans expected a slaughter. The convoy consisted of 43 merchant ships protected by a reinforced escort group. Instead of the anticipated victory, the Germans sailed into a disaster. The battle raged from April 28th to May 6th. Over 40 U-boats from wolf packs named after birds, Star and Think, attacked repeatedly. The convoy's escorts, reinforced by long-range aircraft from Iceland and Newfoundland, fought back with devastating effectiveness. When the battle ended, 6 U-boats had been destroyed. The convoy lost 13 merchant ships, a painful toll, but far less than the Germans had expected.
More importantly, the exchange rate had shifted decisively against the submarines. Donitz could not afford to trade one U-boat for every 2 merchant ships. Convoy SC-130 crossing in the opposite direction later that month proved even more catastrophic for Germany. The convoy lost 0 ships while destroying 5 German submarines. One of those submarines was U-954, commanded by an officer whose death would strike Admiral Donitz personally. Lieutenant Sir Peter Donitz, the admiral's younger son, served as watch officer aboard U-954. The submarine was sunk with all hands on May 19, 1943, by hedgehog attacks from the British frigates HMS Sennen and HMS Jed. Peter Donitz was 21 years old. Notably, the admiral makes no mention of U-954 in his memoirs. His son's death came just 5 days before he was forced to admit defeat. The statistics from Black May were devastating for Germany. 41 U-boats were destroyed by enemy action during the month, with total losses from all causes reaching 43. This represented roughly 25% of the operational submarine fleet. Germany had approximately 240 operational U-boats at the time, with 118 at sea. Donitz had no choice. On May 24, 1943, he ordered his submarines to withdraw from the North Atlantic hunting grounds. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point. The withdrawal order, preserved in German naval archives, acknowledged that enemy aircraft had played a decisive role in inflicting the unsustainable losses. The technological advantages that had swung against Germany were overwhelming and growing more lopsided every month. Allied aircraft now carried radar that could detect a submarine's periscope from miles away. Long-range B-24 Liberator bombers, modified for very long-range patrols of approximately 2,400 miles, closed the mid-Atlantic gap where submarines had once hunted without fear of air attack. These aircraft contributed to sinking between 72 and 93 U-boats during the war. The Mark 24 acoustic torpedo, serenamed Fado, was first used operationally on May 12, 1943, and achieved an effectiveness rate of approximately 20%, compared to less than 10% for depth charges. And ultra-intelligence from broken Enigma codes meant that Allied commanders often knew where the wolf packs were gathering before the submarines arrived. American hunter-killer groups took the offensive, actively seeking out U-boat rather than waiting for attacks on convoys. These task groups typically consisted of one escort carrier and several destroyer escorts operating independently to find and destroy submarines. The escort carrier USS Bogue and her destroyer escorts accounted for 12 to 13 confirmed submarine kills during the war, making her the most successful anti-submarine carrier of any navy. The USS Card destroyed 11 U-boats. These ships turned the hunters into the hunted. The battle produced extraordinary individual stories of courage and sacrifice on both sides. On November 1, 1943, the destroyer USS Bory engaged the submarine U-405 in a surface battle that became the stuff of naval legend. The Bory was an old 4-stack destroyer from the First World War, operating as part of the escort carrier Card's hunter-killer group. After detecting the submarine, the Bory attacked with guns and depth charges. U-405 surfaced to fight back with deck guns. What followed was chaos. The Bory rammed the submarine, and the two vessels became locked together at a 25 to 30 degree angle, the destroyer's bow riding up on the submarine's deck. At point-blank range, where neither ship could effectively use its main weapons, the crews fought with whatever they could find. American sailors fired Thompson's submachine guns, shotguns, rifles, and pistols. Germans responded with their own small arms. Men threw knives and empty shell casings at each other. One American sailor killed a German with a flare gun fired directly into his chest. A sheathed knife thrown by a Bory crewman struck a German officer. The Bory eventually broke free and sank the submarine at 2:57 in the morning. All 49 German crew members perished, but the American ship had suffered too much damage to survive. Her hull was breached, her engines failing. The following day, with rescue impossible in the heavy seas, the Bori was abandoned and sunk by American aircraft to prevent her from falling into enemy hands. 27 of her crew died during the abandonment. 129 survived. Lieutenant Charles Hutchins, the ship's commanding officer and reportedly the Navy's youngest destroyer commander at the age of 30, received the Navy Cross for his actions. Admiral Royal Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, presented the medal aboard the USS Card on November 10, 1943. The USS Guadalcanal in June of 1944 achieved something that had not happened since 1815. On June 4th, operating approximately 150 miles off the coast of Rio de Oro, in what was then Spanish Sahara, Captain Daniel Gallery's Task Group 22.3 made sonar contact with a submerged submarine at 11:09 in the morning. Gallery had trained his crews specifically for this moment, rehearsing capture procedures that most naval officers considered impossible under combat conditions. After forcing U-505 to the surface with depth charges and hedgehog attacks, Gallery made the audacious decision to try to capture the submarine rather than sink it. A boarding party scrambled down into the damaged U-boat, preventing the scuttling charges from detonating and keeping the vessel afloat. It was the first enemy warship captured at sea by the United States Navy in over a century. That submarine now sits in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, a trophy of American victory that visitors can walk through to this day. Henry Kaiser's revolution spread beyond his own shipyards. His methods were adopted across the American shipbuilding industry, transforming production into something the world had never seen. Resistance from traditionalists, who believed ships could only be built the old way, melted in the face of Kaiser's results. If prefabrication and welding and assembly line techniques could produce ships faster and just as seaworthy, the old craftsmen had no argument left. Bethlehem Steel Corporation, operating 4 shipyards, learned Kaiser's lessons and became a national production power.
Operated 15 shipyards that produced over 1,100 ships during the war, more than any other builder, and nearly 1/3 of the entire two-ocean fleet. Bath Iron Works in Maine launched a new destroyer every 17 days on average during peak production, producing 83 destroyers total. By the war's end, American yards had delivered 6,768 naval vessels of all types, plus thousands more merchant ships. On Victory over Japan Day, the United States Navy operated 28 aircraft carriers, 71 escort carriers, 23 battleships, 72 cruisers, 377 destroyers, and over 230 submarines. The workers who made this possible deserve recognition that history too often forgets. Shipyard laborers worked in conditions that would be considered intolerable by any modern standard. They worked 6- and 7-day weeks, often in 12-hour shifts. Welders suffered flash burns to their eyes from the blinding arc light. Riveters went deaf from the constant hammering. The yards were dangerous places where accidents killed and maimed workers at rates that would shut down any modern factory. Yet production never stopped. Patriotism, good wages, and the knowledge that their brothers and sons and husbands were fighting overseas kept the assembly lines running around the clock. Kaiser understood that keeping workers healthy and productive required more than just good pay. In 1933, a doctor named Sidney Barfield had opened a small hospital in the Mojave Desert for workers building the Colorado River Aqueduct. Kaiser recruited Garfield to provide medical care for workers at Grand Coulee Dam in 1938, then brought him to the Richmond shipyards. The Permanente Health Plan opened on June 1, 1942. Workers paid 50 cents per week for comprehensive medical coverage. By August 1944, over 92% of Richmond employees had enrolled. The plan opened to the public on July 21, 1945. It evolved into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare organizations in America today. Donuts tried to fight back with new technology.
German engineers developed the Schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged. They designed new submarine types that were faster and could dive deeper than anything before. The Type 21 submarine, which began entering service in 1945, was genuinely revolutionary. It could stay underwater almost indefinitely using improved batteries and streamlined hull design. The Type 21 was faster submerged than most escorts were on the surface. But the new technology came too late and in too few numbers to matter. American shipyards, by contrast, built ships faster than German submarines could sink them. The crossover point came in September of 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor. In that month, North American yards delivered 713,000 tons of new merchant shipping, while 500,000 tons were lost to enemy action. It was a milestone that changed everything. From that point forward, new construction exceeded losses every single month until the end of the war, with only one brief exception. By December of 1943, cumulative new construction had completely replaced all merchant shipping losses suffered by the Allies since September of 1939. The tonnage war was over. Germany had lost. Dönitz understood what had happened better than most. In his memoirs, published in 1958 under the title 10 Years and 20 Days, the admiral admitted that Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. He wrote candidly about the failure of the U-boat campaign and the factors that had defeated it. At his Nuremberg trial in 1946, he had already acknowledged the decisive role of technology, testifying that Allied radar was, in his words, next to the atomic bomb, the decisive war-winning invention of the Anglo-Americans. His private acknowledgement went further. He knew that German intelligence had underestimated American shipbuilding capacity catastrophically, that the enemy had known all of Germany's secrets through broken codes, while Germany had known almost nothing accurate about the enemy. The final irony came on April 30th, 1945. As Soviet soldiers closed in on his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler took his own life. His political testament, written the day before, designated Dönitz as his successor, not as Führer, a title Hitler abolished, but as Reich's president of a Reich that had only days left to exist. Dönitz led what remained of the German government from the town of Flensburg on the Danish border for 23 days, overseeing the military surrender on May 7th and 8th, before British forces arrested him and his cabinet on May 23rd under orders from General Eisenhower. At the Nuremberg trials that followed, Dönitz was convicted of war crimes related to his conduct of the U-boat campaign and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was the lightest sentence handed down at Nuremberg. Other convicted Nazi leaders were released early for health reasons. Dönitz was not. He served every day of that sentence at Spandau prison, finally walking free on October 1st, 1956. Dönitz outlived most of his former enemies, dying on December 24, 1980, at the age of 89. He never stopped defending the U-boat campaign or arguing that he had been treated unfairly at Nuremberg, but he also never denied the fundamental truth of what had happened. Germany had bet that America could not build ships fast enough to matter. Germany had lost that bet, and the cost was everything. The ships that American workers built during World War II are almost all gone now. Most of the Liberty ships were scrapped in the years after the war, their steel recycled into automobiles and applications and the infrastructure of peacetime prosperity.
The escort carriers went to the breakers or were sunk as targets in weapons tests. Only a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts remain as museum ships, preserved by veterans groups and history enthusiasts who understand what they represent. But the lesson they taught remains as relevant as ever. Industrial capacity is not just a matter of factories and raw materials. It is not simply counting shipways and calculating construction times the way German intelligence tried to do.
It is a matter of human ingenuity, determination, and the willingness of ordinary people to work together toward a common goal. It is about whether a society can adapt, innovate, and mobilize when its very survival demands it. Germany's greatest miscalculation was not underestimating American steel production or counting shipyard capacity incorrectly. It was failing to understand what happens when a democracy decides to fight. The workers of Richmond and Baltimore and Bath did not build ships because they were ordered to. They built them because they chose to, because they believed in what they were fighting for, and because they refused to let their country lose. Women who had never held a welding torch learned to arc weld in 2 weeks and then built ships that crossed oceans. Farmers who had never seen the sea became riveters and fitters. African Americans who had been told they could not do skilled work proved that claim a lie. The strategic implications extended far beyond the Atlantic. The same shipyards that defeated the U-boats built the fleet that carried American forces across the Pacific. The escort carriers that closed the Atlantic Gap also provided close air support for island-hopping campaigns from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. The techniques perfected in Liberty ship construction were applied to building tank landing ships, attack transports, and the countless specialized vessels needed for amphibious warfare. Every landing craft that hit the beaches at Normandy, every supply ship that kept the Pacific Fleet operating thousands of miles from home, traced its lineage to the Industrial Revolution that Henry Kaiser and his competitors ignited. The women who had proven themselves in the shipyards did not simply disappear when peace returned. Many were pushed out of their jobs to make room for returning veterans, but they had demonstrated capabilities that could not be unlearned or forgotten. The experience of wartime work planted seeds that would grow into the women's movement of later decades. Rosie the Riveter became more than a propaganda poster. She became a symbol of what women could achieve when given the opportunity. Similarly, the African American workers who had integrated Kaiser's shipyards carried their experiences into the civil rights struggles that followed. They had worked alongside white workers, performed the same skilled jobs, and earned the same wages. The lie of racial inferiority had been exposed on the production line. The Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and racism at home, drew strength from wartime achievements that could not be denied. The legacy of American shipbuilding extended into the post-war economy in ways both visible and hidden. The management techniques developed to coordinate tens of thousands of workers across multiple shifts became standard practice in American industry. The prefabrication methods pioneered for ships were adapted for housing construction, helping to build the suburbs that transformed American life. The very idea that complex products could be broken down into standardized components, assembled by workers trained in weeks rather than years, reshaped manufacturing worldwide. Kaiser himself became one of America's most prominent industrialists after the war. He built automobiles, aluminum plants, and entire planned communities. The healthcare system he created for his shipyard workers grew into a model for prepaid medical care that influenced the development of health maintenance organizations across the country. The man who had never built a ship before 1940 left a mark on American life that extended far beyond the vessels that slid down his ways. The contrast between German and American approaches to industrial warfare could not have been starker. Germany relied on skilled craftsmen and centralized planning, producing sophisticated weapons in limited numbers. America relied on mass production and decentralized innovation, producing adequate weapons in overwhelming quantities. The U-boat was a marvel of engineering, but each one took months to build and required a highly trained crew. The Liberty ship was deliberately simple, designed to be built quickly by workers who had never seen the ocean. In the end, quantity had a quality all its own. History remembers the admirals and the generals, the politicians and the diplomats. It remembers Churchill and Roosevelt, Dönitz and King. But the Battle of the Atlantic was won by people whose names appear on no monuments, whose faces look out from no portraits. It was won by shipyard workers who learned their trade in Kaiser training programs and spent the war joining steel plates on the midnight shift. It was won by farmers from Oklahoma and Nebraska who had never seen salt water before 1942 and spent 3 years building destroyer escorts in Boston and Bath. It was won by the uncounted thousands who answered their country's call and built the ships that made victory possible. Those workers knew what they were fighting for. They read the newspapers. They saw the casualty lists. Many of them had sons or brothers or husbands serving overseas. They understood that every ship they built might be the one that carried their loved ones home safely. They understood that every day they shaved off construction time meant supplies reaching the front sooner, meant fewer soldiers dying for lack of ammunition or fuel or food. When historians debate why the Allies won the Second World War, they point to many factors: Soviet manpower and sacrifice on the Eastern Front, British resilience during the darkest days of the Blitz, American industrial capacity that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could match, the foolishness of Hitler's strategic decisions. All of these mattered. But beneath the grand strategy and the famous battles lay a foundation built by ordinary people doing extraordinary work. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won at sea. It was won in shipyards by workers who never heard a shot fired in anger, whose only weapon was a welding torch or a rivet gun. Adolf Hitler looked across the Atlantic in 1941 and saw a nation he believed was too weak.
Too divided, too decadent to threaten his 1,000-year Reich. He could not have been more wrong. The United States, he dismissed, proved capable of feats of production that his own orderly, disciplined Germany could not match. The democracy he mocked as inefficient mobilized its people with a speed and effectiveness that his dictatorship could not approach. The industrial power that Germany could not counter was not built on racial purity or military tradition. It was built on something Hitler never understood and could never have countered. Karl Donnet sent his submarines to strangle Britain and defeat America before it could bring its strength to bear. He failed because he could not strangle the will of a nation that had decided to win. The U-boats lie on the bottom of the Atlantic now, their crews entombed in rusting steel. The ships they tried to stop are gone too, scrapped and recycled into the prosperity of peacetime. But the lesson endures. When free people choose to fight together, no force on earth can stop